All right, so next up we've got Lucas and Alexa. Welcome, both of you.
Hi, hello, thanks.
Yeah, we are also known as XK Studio. And yeah, happy to be here. Thanks for having us.
So give us a little rundown about yourselves.
So we've been working together for quite some time now. We met at London studio called Future Deluxe. Then we went to Memphis Machine and spent a few years there. And then after that, we set up our own little practice, which we recently kind of branded as XK Studio. And we kind of launched it as a platform to put all our stuff together, mix our commercial and our kind of self-initiated work, and do the sort of style of work that we like to do, which is quite daring, art, design-driven kind of motion graphics for brands and clients.
So how does Houdini help you achieve those objectives?
Well, we like using Houdini. We've been using it I've been using it for 5 years.
I think I have been using it for 4 years, I think.
Yeah, and we started kind of just dipped our toes in it a little bit, and then we just kind of got consumed. And what we like is, Houdini gives you the possibility to just do anything you want without any restriction. In our industry, a lot of people use, say, Cinema 4D or other tools where you kind of have to rely a lot on using plugins and effects and other things to kind of get things done. But with Houdini, you can just build all those things yourself if you feel like it, or you have this massive, tremendous simulation tools at your disposal to just do as you please. But it's important for us to kind of look at it through the design lens as well.
Yeah, I feel like the difference between us using Houdini from a kind of like design point of view, but then using these really powerful tools that are usually used in film and like VFX, we have something quite unique where we could create almost kind of like simulation-driven design, and really allows us to push our kind of like visual style and like capabilities in a way that a typical software wouldn't be able to do. So that's kind of like the niche that we are really kind of like enjoying and exploiting.
Very cool. What's your presentation going to be about today?
So we took a bunch of the projects that we finished as an XK Studio over the past couple of years, and we're going to talk through how they came to be. We're going to show some interesting setups from each of the projects, also some R&D work, and show the kind of ways how we use the simulation and procedural tools with the design aspect, and the kind of interesting play, how you can design a simulation, or you can simulate and arrive at something that's designed, and how they two kind of interplay and what we do with that.
Excellent. Looking forward to it. Let's jump in.
Let's get it going.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in.
We are XK Studio, a London-based design and motion practice. We do a lot of projects that combine procedural and handcrafted forms. We mix them with graphic design and animation, and we strive to create meaningful work that has got a hyper-real and very tactile feel.
What's really important for our practice is that we always try to keep a good balance between commercial projects and commissions and self-initiated work. These self-initiated projects are great for us to explore all kind of weird and interesting topics that we're into, like food or hair, projects that we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation.
The personal projects are very essential to our studio because that is when we can experiment and explore our style the most. In the past, it also happened that a lot of our personal work gets referenced and ends up bringing us commercial projects. So in a way, we can keep moving in a direction that excites us.
Today, we want to talk to you about how we use design combined with simulation techniques, which is quite a fun and interesting way of working. You can take an object you have designed and simulate it to develop its form further. You can arrive at a more complex design by simulating simple shapes in an interesting way, or you can design a simulation from scratch using art-directed forces, colliders, and stuff like that.
We'll talk you through a couple of our projects from the past 2 years that illustrate this approach in a lot more detail. We'll touch on the conceptual side of our work, show you some R&D and behind the scenes by diving into some of our Houdini setups.
Yeah, Houdini has been really crucial for our work on all of these projects. We use it as our main tool along with Redshift Renderer. We really like the freedom it gives us to just achieve anything we set our minds to, especially as we come in from a motion design background. In the past, we often had to rely on plugins to try to achieve our vision, which quite often led to feeling constrained by what each software and plugin allows you to do.
Yeah, with Houdini, you know that if you think of an idea in your head, you know that there will be some way of achieving it. It might take you a bit of time to figure it out, but it will be worth it.
The first project we'll show is Flower, a self-initiated film which started both our journey into the world of flowers, but also it was our first collaboration as a creative duo.
What kickstarted this project was a long-time obsession with bizarre and alien-like cacti and flowers that we've been collecting over the years. We didn't really set out at the start to create a film, but as we were making them, we realized that it might be nice to put them all into a film and use the blossoming motion as a driver for these simulations and turbulent liquids and hairs that you see in the piece. We will play you a making of, which is a collection of some of the early R&D and experiments that didn't make it into the final film.
We combined hand-modeled and sculpted forms. We tried different ways not only to shape the petals but also animate them at the same time using cloth simulation, which gave us the best results both in terms of form, but you also get the benefit of it already moving, which was quite cool. We also employed procedural setups using arrangements such as phyllotaxis, which allowed us to try a lot of different shapes quickly. So it was a great example of using something which is quite mathematical at its core, but gives you quite organic result at the end.
One of the key flowers in the film was inspired by this cacti called crassula. It was something that we had in our studio, and we really loved how procedural and almost MoGraphy it looked, and wanted to find a way to recreate it digitally and bring it to life by giving it this organic and violent motion. We will talk you through the Houdini setup of how this was achieved.
So this is the crassula setup from the flower film and how the individual piece looked like. We have a bit of a jiggle, so let's see how that looks just raw. And it was an interesting challenge replicating this motion. We had a rig that controlled the thickness and scale along the spline. We had a bit of random scale as well. We could control the amount of them, and also what was good was this super tight control over how each of the buds sort of opens and closes as we go, with a bit of rotation there as well. So the core of the setup is basically just copying these individual pieces onto a curve and then opening them as we go. The trick though was to also move them kind of up as they animate, because otherwise you would just get a lot of intersection between them. And also if you look at the actual plant opening, you see that these buds, they kind of come from within the previous bud. So to do that, we always moved the top pieces down, and as they animated in, they kind of came back up. And to control the individual animations, we baked this hand animated data and then kind of blend between them. And how that was done, here are the controls for the asset. You can see we have specified how long the actual animation is, and then we can reduce these 30 frames down to a lot less frames. So in this case, this is reduced into 5 frames. You can see that's kind of fairly accurate. Reducing it down to say 3 frames is not very good. But going back to say 10, you can see that that's almost indistinguishable from the original 30 frames that we had. And well, the way how it works is we sample the different times of the animation depending on how many we are reducing them to, and we store the position data at the given frame, and we store it into an array on each frame. Here you can see in the spreadsheet you get all the data in there, and then for each of the points we later kind of lerp or blend between these values to recreate the original animation. Now the thing is that you do that, and of course this is kind of in place facing one direction. Once you copy this onto your spline, they all kind of retain their original position rather than keep the orientation from the spline. So after restoring the animation, there's a little bit of a quaternion multiplication, taking the original orient and transforming it back to how they're supposed to be. And at the end, there's a bit of that jiggle to just help to finish it off and make it look a little bit more interesting.
A couple of months after we published Flower, we received an email from Velcro Australia. They saw the film and they wanted to commission us to create a tribute film that tells the origin story of Velcro and the hook and loop technology that's behind their product. We were super excited because this was again another great opportunity to delve deeper into the world of animated flora, and we also had quite a bit of experience working with threads and Flyknit in the past, so this was a great project to combine both of these worlds.
what we set out to illustrate was the story of Velcro and how the invention came to be. It was originally created by George de Mestral, who was an inventor that came up with this hook and loop design after walking his dog in Swiss Alps and noticing this burdock plant that attached to his coat and his dog's fur. So he was quite intrigued by how this burdock plant attached to it, and after studying it closer under a microscope, he noticed these hundreds of tiny hooks that attach to anything with a loop, such as clothing or fur. And this gave him the idea of recreating a similar system that has since proven very useful in the textile industry.
So our film follows this narrative in a more abstracted and poetic way, and using the burdock plant at its core, we draw parallels between the technology and the nature that inspired it. And we started the process by putting a quite rough mood film and animatic together, where we outlined the different chapters, and at the same time we worked on exploring them in detail.
We iterated through loads of different designs and ideas for compositions of all the elements, the plant, the Velcro fastener and the environments. We tried lots of different things with the burr plant, which was quite interesting as there are many different species which all look quite different from one another. And because we didn't really know exactly which one to depict, we abstracted them all together to sort of design something that looked photoreal and convincing, but wasn't actually based on any particular plant or exact species.
In order to create our burr plant exactly the way we wanted, we quickly realized that we will have to build our own rig from scratch. So using a phyllotaxis arrangement as our base, we have built built-in controls that allows us to very quickly manipulate the overall look of the burr. So for instance, we change the number of hooks, its radius, we can move them up based on their position to the center, etc. Now to fine-tune this look, we can adjust each hook individually. So we can change its profile via curve and control the state of its bend depending on how further down the spline is located.
Our next project is a visual campaign we created for London Symphony Orchestra and their 2019-2020 season. Let's play the film first.
The name of the campaign and the idea behind it was Roots and Origins. And the concept was that we wanted to express the enormous power of an orchestra by presenting it as a huge garden that is filled with different flowers that represent different musicians and different instruments, and they all come together in harmony. Then this garden is traced back to its origin, in our case a single seed, playing with the concept of blossoming but in reverse.
The entire garden and the animation of the film is built based on mocap data of LSO's famous conductor Sir Simon Rattle. We use this data to create the main binds onto which our flowers are placed, and also triggered their reversed bloom animation. We really wanted to keep as much of the original character from the motion capture. You can really see how expressive he is in his motion, and it was really important to us to trigger the animation of each element based entirely on his movement.
Here you can see a side view of our entire film, frozen in a 4D sculpture, that you could call it, and see how it's composed of several different chapters along its length. Before we arrived at this solution, we spent quite a bit of time exploring various ways in which we can use this mock-up data. Here, for example, we traced the conductor's movements vertically and used the distance between his hands to drive the size of these stems.
Here was another approach, particularly the one on the left, which shows a frozen sculpture that was going to function as a trunk of a tree out of which we'd grown other small elements that were going to be triggered by the hand motion traveling down.
At the end, we thought that having the camera travel inside of a moving sculpture like this was going to be more interesting. So here you can see a first prototype of that final film. And what we really liked was that the audience felt a lot more immersed. And as the film progressed and the screen was covered less and less, it really spoke to the concept of tracing this back to its roots and reducing in size.
Here are a bunch of frames that came from our exploration period. We tried different kind of elements and mapped out journey throughout the different sections. When it came down to designing these individual elements, we first started by making quite complex shapes and animations, but realized that those were looking quite messy once you had lots of them on a screen moving at the same time. So we had to reduce their complexity and make things, elements and plants that were a bit simpler but read well when used in bigger bunches.
As the idea was that we are tracing this back to its origins, the animations had to show these elements retracting, and our first instinct was to animate them grow first, and then you play that backwards, but this looked quite obvious. So instead we developed ways that allowed us to do a reversed blossom almost, that would look a lot more naturally. And we did that by using attractors, pulling cloth elements through like colliders, and using a lot of these guided vellum simulations. Let's have a look at one example. Now this uses a combination of a vellum guided sim with colliders and several deformers. So we start with a bunch of tubes which we animate down from the center. This will then be used as a match animation guide to drive our vellum simulation as our next step. So here we also add a torus, which we'll then use as our collider. This will push the tubes and like squeeze them at their base. So here is the resulting animation, where you can see how they're trying to squeeze in through the torus. Now this looks pretty cool, but it is a little bit jittery. So we then use a chops filter, which does a great job at smoothing it. So we then delete the part of the tubes behind the torus. We fill in the gaps and use we taper down the bottom of it using a bend deformer, like the taper that's part of the bend deformer. So this is how it looks subdivided. Later on, we use our baking asset to render out the Redshift proxy files. Now, this asset allows us to fit each animation within a unit sphere and give it the right orientation. Now, doing it this way, we are able to stay consistent when it comes to each element and its size, and also the way that it faces. Another thing worth mentioning is that when we started scattering these elements across the trails, we wanted to be able to art direct them quite precisely and not just scatter them randomly. Also, it was important, as it was such a heavy scene, to work with proxies and only send instance points information to the renderer. So I'll quickly run you through how we did that. So I started by importing these elements and just get a static version of the animation. I poly reduce it so it doesn't overwhelm the viewport later on. Once I have that, I then grab the trail with an object merge. I merge the trail in. Now I group a bunch of faces where I want these leaves to go exactly. I scatter some points on that. I give it a p-scale and some random orientation just to begin with. And then with a copy SOP set to pack an instance, I put these across. And here with an edit, I'm literally grabbing each leaf and I rearrange it into place until I'm quite happy. So it no longer intersects and it does look a little bit neater and nicer. We did that with all the hand-placed elements, and quite importantly now, once we were happy with how they looked, we extracted the point information from the packed primitives, their rotation, scale, all those edits that we did by hand, and replaced the geometry with the Redshift proxy sequences, which were being triggered at the right time to sync with the hand movement. This way, the super heavy scene, filled with hundreds of animated elements, was sent to the renderer quite quickly, almost instantly.
So this idea of using a guide and then simulating something sort of backwards and then playing it forwards, we later on developed this a bit further in this R&D, which isn't actually part of the LSO project, but I think it's a good point in the presentation to show this one. So you can see a little bit more interesting blossoming of a flower. Here as an input, we're using a static mesh that was imported from outside of Houdini, and we are bending and kind of creating this guide animation. Here we kind of made it a little bit easier for us to kind of grab some point numbers that we knew and use an expression in the bend object in for each loop to make our job a bit easier, so we didn't have to position the bend for each individual object or do something, kind of having to rebuild this with like a copy SOP or something. So here we just pointed the bend from one point to another, which were then on all the petals, giving us this guide, which of course has got some serious issues with intersections. Even though the kind of individual animation of the petals is correct, we use a little time effector which just shifts each individual piece and offsets it in time by any given number of frames, which here means that the inside petals are closing in first, followed by the ones on the outside. And we use this as a guide for a cloth sim. So here you can see that there's nothing really special in this cloth setup. We're just using a relatively high bend stiffness. Here in the constraint which we match to animation, it's a very low stretch stiffness, so that the pedals are kind of allowed to have a bit of their individual motion. And then on the solver, we just use a fair bit of substeps, just 3 substeps, and no gravity and nothing else. But you can see that the result of the simulation follows the guide with the significant difference that the individual pedals don't intersect. So we get this neatly packed little bundle. And indeed, if we use clip to sort of look through this flower, you can see that these pieces are not intersecting and everything is neatly packed. So then going and using this animation of the flower packing in and reverting it, or reversing it, gives us a sort of flower opening animation, which already looks quite interesting, but the individual buds or the individual petals are not very interesting. They're quite rigid and they just kind of lock in space. So here what we're going to do is we will also animate the rest length, and here to help is a little bit of a setup that kind of animates in an attribute as the individual buds open. You can see that they kind of green in, which will be later used to control the rest length inside of the vellum solver. So here we're just naming the different constraints differently, and the solver, again, there is not much on it, apart from inside we're changing the constraint property for the rest length here, and the actual stretch, the pin animation, using that factor from earlier, which was animated with the green color. Then the result you can see is a lot more interesting. There is a bit of kind of flicking in there, which is easily smooth using a chop filter. But overall, it's a lot more interesting animation than any of the previous steps. Just to finish this off, we can subdivide it and thicken it. We build this asset for thickening, which is similar to the lab one or the game dev one, with the difference that you can actually shrink the original outside edges. So here we control the depth, and then I think we're going to need some normals to actually see the shrinking. But here you can see that as we lower it, you're getting a quite thick edge, but you can, with this, you can kind of shrink it in, which gives a lot more realistic result, as petals of a flower would be thicker in the middle and they would get a lot thinner as you get to the edge. So this is how that looks at the end, and you can see it's got this kind of weird violent nature that you would see if you would actually watch a real flower opening as a time lapse. They move in this kind of like strange alien fashion, so this technique gets quite close to recreating that type of motion and look. It's quite successful at that.
Strange Spring was commissioned by another Australian client, which allowed us to explore the world of strange flora a bit further.
Having the frames from our previous London Symphony Orchestra project as a starting point, we wanted to take these flowers into even more alien place. We also wanted to reduce the amount of the flowers on screen and really focus on crafting each individual one and making a cleaner, hopefully more beautiful composition.
Part of the concept was that these flowers are waking up from winter into the spring. So we introduced the elements of melting ice and water droplets, which acted as a distorting lens. and also as a way to balance the complexity of these flowers with a lot simpler and cleaner shapes.
We were inspired by AI gun tools, and we played around with quite a few online tools to synthesize and collect some references, which was really cool to see all these weird shapes, and for us then to try to translate some of these ideas and forms into our own flowers. Again, we combined a variety of different approaches to make these, but also mixed in some a little bit more relatable looking real plants to make the visual a little bit more legible.
As we built layers and layers of these flowers, it was handy for us to use the background image feature in the node editor to literally place the individual flower geonodes over it that acted as a map and made it a lot easier for us to find the objects we were looking for. Let's have a look in more detail at how we built one of these flowers. We will take you through the creation of one of our flowers. This one is a particularly interesting one as it uses several techniques. We have vellum, we have liquid sim, we also use a little bit of vellum draping, a classic reaction diffusion for our core. We also scatter some groomed hair and several other elements that complete our look. To create the top part of the flower, we started with a basic modeled shape. But in order to create the beautiful folds that you see in the final piece, we drove the rest length of the simulation with a black and white pattern. Here we have an asset that allows us to quickly apply different patterns such as dots, lines, and noise. So the black and white values of our pattern drives the rest length of the simulation. So here you can see that for each frame the rest length gets updated based on those values. Now if we run the simulation for a few frames, we can see that where we have the white value it expands, and then where we have the black it contracts it. So we use a frozen state of this plant to then arrange in space into something that resembles more of a open flower. And looking at the core of the plant, we started with a pretty simple sphere. We ran a reaction diffusion, nothing too fancy, pretty standard solver there, which gives us a quite blobby looking core for our plant. For the stem, we used a liquid simulation where we basically have two spheres that emit liquid particles towards each other. Again, nothing too complicated here, but so we used a frozen frame from our simulation. We mesh it to get more of a solid look for our stem. We gave it a little collar, which was basically a tube with a little bit of vellum drape on top. We thickened it and subdivided. Now, for the rest of our plant, we further added several elements. Extra on the top of the plant, we added a little bit of hair, which we groomed into place. And further, we scattered a couple more elements and gave a bit of color in order to finalize our look.
So next up is a walk through this particular sim and the scene which shows a gradual meltdown of a block of ice that reveals a flower hiding inside. So to take you through this, let's have a look. It's basically a box that at the start is split using a Boolean cut. It's a bevel box that we use a grid with a bit of mounting angled to sort of cut through. Then the top bit is isolated and fractured using the concrete preset on RBD material fracture. That gives us that kind of Voronoi fractured pattern that later on we apply a MOPS fall-off to activate these individual pieces in a linear fashion. Here on the side is a little preview of how that would look as an actual RBD sim. This isn't used in the shot. This is just to kind of preview this. Was an experiment at the start of the setup. You can see how as we activate the pieces, and this is just simple kind of update of an activate parameter or an activate attribute, the pieces become active and they fall as they collide against the bottom part of that Boolean cut. So here is the same thing kind of showing if we delete the activated pieces, that's later used for meshing and combining it together. The activated pieces are just aged so that we can kind of grab them on the first frame when they become active, and we use that first frame to source particles into a fluid sim. So you can see here kind of each frame, one of the pieces injects particles into a flip sim. So if the sim itself is just a basic flip sim with a viscosity enabled and an OpenCL use to just make it a little bit faster. And you can see that the bottom was used to collide against, and here the age of the particles is used to control the viscosity so that the particles get less viscous as we progress through the simulation. Here, just showing how adding these particles that kind of accumulates and builds the simulation. Here later on, the kind of chiseled away piece is combined with this. So these particles are meshed and turn into BDB. So is this bit that we showed earlier where the individual pieces are being deleted, and kind of combining the two together using the fluid mesh and the kind of chiseled away pieces and VDB merging them and smoothing them is what creates the final effect where there's the illusion that the individual pieces kind of go and melt, where in fact it's a combination of the flip and that chiseled away animation. One of the self-initiated projects that was completed under our studio name last year was 0% Food, which began as a series of explorations that we later put together and edited into a film. So the first piece from the series was this one called 0% Burger. And it started with me seeing a picture of this oversized burger that had lots of different floors stacked up on one another, which sparked my curiosity about how would that look if I recreated it in CG. And what was really interesting was the realization that different types of dishes, particularly fast food, are interesting not only from their nutritional point of view, but also from the point of view of the mechanics of how they're put together, how a hamburger is made up from all these different layers, how a sausage roll is made by rolling something, etc., etc. So this led to me exploring these different types of food and motion that they inspired. Next, I'll play a time lapse of how all these elements that make up this burger were created, the shading and the rendering. So I'll just talk along a little bit. It's probably going to be quite hard for me to catch up with this, as that's quite drastically sped up. But what you will generally see is a lot of modeling using VDB and then remeshing it. You could see like a quick frame of ZBrush, which has got the zero measure in, which we used in some of the cases, but most of the time I was actually really happy with the instant meshes and the link that you can have using the side effects labs, which is really cool. There's a new version, or like a new addition, that uses a quad remesher from Exercise, I think, which is also pretty amazing. So that's really cool to use, particularly with VDB meshes, which create quite kind of jaggedy and jittery surface that can really produce some kind of nasty looking normals, especially if it's a bit more plastic, a bit more smooth looking surface. So having the ability to remesh it directly in Houdini with quads that can be later subdivided is really cool and really useful. So here, further on, you can see just use of all these different subtools that you can have in Houdini, exploring, extruding different elements and just making weird looking shapes and things. This particular one here was one that the instant meshes didn't handle quite well, so that was brought in ZBrush. I used Photoshop here to quickly bash some textures together. Lately I've been playing with some cops as well. I didn't use it on this one, but I've been trying to use it more and more. But here in this case, it was just using the Photoshop textures that were brought in, using some triplanar to make it a bit easier to map these on, and using stuff like curvature or Fresnel for the shading. A lot of these shaders are kind of semi-procedural, so using some textures in combination with things like ramps and different noises and things like that. So here I kind of started to render the individual elements and put them in a board to see them all next to each other, because it's if you do these individually, it can be quite easy to lose track of how they all look together. And here's the first version of the finished piece. So next up is the setup that I'll break down, which is this kind of sausage looking thing on the left. And this particular piece was actually a collaboration with V&A, or Victoria and Albert Museum in London, who had an exhibition about food at the time. And I was really inspired by Sausage of the Future by Caroline Niebling. I hope I pronounce it right. And made this sliced sausage animation, which I'll talk you through next. So breaking this sausage down, I have a little setup to create a quad topology capsule, which is then scattered inside with multiple different pieces. These kind of simple primitives are then VDB'd, and in a for each loop, which kind of drives the effect. You see that for each individual kind of run, we take the iteration number and we map it and reshape it, which grows it, and also sort of combine and cut it against the original tube. So that is then turned into polygons, and we can see here as I run through the passes as we start from the inside and grow these outside. This is then remeshed into quads, which gives kind of cleaner geometry. And to sort of show that, you can see that the individual pieces kind of represent the different VDB reshapes. So you start with the original shape, which is at the core, and then each of the slices kind of represent the shape growing. So this is a sort of a similar effect that you might get if you cut a tree and see the sort of years in the trunk being cut. So later on, these pieces are UV'd and sliced. So here's a line with a bunch of points on it, and the points on the line are then used, the position of each point is then used to kind of clip back and front of this sausage, which then yields a kind of sliced look, where if we go through the passes, we can see that each individual slice is just like a bit of that original sausage clipped from either side. Then this is not actually used for the simulation itself. It's just a bit too busy and messy. Instead, we use the line here to copy a disk, a quad disk onto it. This is used to simulate using a simple cloth and kind of activating this using a sort of simple follow-up that just runs through it. Having this affects the mass, which you can use in the Vellum solver to kind of activate the individual pieces. So here the mass is updated using the external input, and viewing the sim shows you how kind of each of these slices in a linear fashion gets activated and falls down. So this was then used, retimed slightly, and used with a rest position to point deform the original kind of sliced aged sausage here. So here was just a little setup that allowed to use a different color for the inside pieces, but use a kind of unified color for the outside. And here, the way how it works, that for each of these slices, we take a corresponding slice from the kind of original sausage. We point deform it, and that's what sort of drives that simulation. So we're getting the simple animation, but that's applied on that bit more complicated geo coming from here. So at the end, there's just a bit of attribute promote and stuff like that, just to get the right attributes into the material and the shader. But that's basically the gist of it. Here is just a little randomizer that applies different materials on the different pieces of the geometry, just so that we can get a random stuff.
As we are nearing the end of our presentation, we are going to wrap up by showing you our last project for today, which is called Hair. This was also a self-initiated series that was born from a fascination with the beauty and movement of hair. Hair has this capacity to move in a mesmerizing and very elegant way, which I personally find really satisfying. On the other hand, I was also quite keen to take the hair away from how it's usually used in CG and instead use it as a graphic element in a more unconventional way. Also, when we choose our personal projects, we look for our subjects to have the right mix of artistry and technical challenge. So working with hair ticked all these boxes for me. Especially at that time, I just started working with Houdini hair tools and very quickly saw how powerful they are. And right at the start, just by trying it out, I got already quite excited about taking the groomed hair and simulate the thousands of strands super quickly and achieve that mesmerizing motion that I was obsessing about over the last few weeks. Most of the time, I didn't usually follow a typical hair grooming process, but instead had to come up with my own techniques. So instead I used a lot of hand-drawn curves, either free-flowing or projected onto a surface, a combination of colliders and either static or animated, and using that along pop forces with vellum that allowed me not to just shape the hair the way I wanted, but also to guide the movement in a very elegant and controlled manner. Going back to the theme of the presentation, which is design meets simulation, here is one example where by setting up very quickly a disc, generate some hairs from it, make that quite long, give it a few forces, in this case a pop axis force with some extra turbulence and a object to collide with, which in this instance an animated bending tube. You arrive at this hair sculpture that would be quite tricky to model or guide by hand. So in a way we can argue that the simulation solver is often our collaborator, and a spontaneous test like this can spark further ideas, which then I can continue to refine. I also explored using hair in a more typical manner and generating it from a head geometry of a 3D model. So I'll quickly walk you through one of my hair grooming setups. So this uses the Houdini hair shelf tools. I found this to be quite a quick way to generate your hair from a geometry and have the flexibility to kind of brush your guides and control them into place. Then you can sim it. You can also create an external dot network if you want to adjust your sim even further. And you can also have a separate kind of object where you will create the hairs based on your guides that will be used for final rendering. Now, to quickly show you how I generated and groomed the top part of the head, I imported a low poly version of my model so I can paint a lot quicker on it. Here I kind of set where exactly I want the hair to be generated on. I then use that black and white map to give, set the length, and quite cool here is that you can use a guide process to set the direction. So you don't have to do any brushing at this point. You can just orient it towards whatever axis you want quite quickly. And then you can brush I brushed a little bit extra into place with using a surface brush. And at the end I added another process to control the bend, so it's a little bit more close to the head of the model. So now that we have our guides, we will then use them to generate a lot more hair that will then be used for rendering. And what's cool about Houdini, that you can use the same tools to groom your guides, to then groom your actual hair further. So for example, here I'm using a cut to go in and just clean up the haircut a little bit further and get like a much neater result. And after that I'm adding a bit of clumping so it doesn't look so regular. Again, this is cool because I can always go back and adjust it if I change my mind. And after that I add a bit of frizz, so there's a little bit more irregularity and the hair is not so straight. Now I did a similar thing on the other side of the head, pretty much following similar process. Now looking at the eyelashes, the animated eyelashes, I generated them again using the same head geometry, but I gave it a map so I can have even finer control of where the hair will be generated. Looking at the animation of the eyelashes, I have simulated those guides using vellum hair. I used quite a bit of stiffness there, have the gravity on and a little bit of wind. I then enabled the collisions, so not only the hair collides with itself, it also doesn't intersect the face of the model. So then I generate the hair based on these animated guides, which pretty much concludes this setup. I'm a bit wary of time, so I think we will end our talk here. Thank you very much everyone for listening. I hope you found some of this useful or at least interesting. I'm going to leave on the screen our Instagram handles and our website if you want to keep in touch. And thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.